Okay, guys, so we're going to be filling in some notes here so that we can get you caught up and get you moving on to some more fun and exciting things in the classroom. This slide is a review of what we should have covered in class today. So you should be very familiar with the 4 things that cause genetic changes. And those 4 things are mutations, environmental changes, radiation, and chemicals. And remember, if you're causing a genetic change, you're causing a change in the DNA, which is going to change your genotype, which eventually is going to change your phenotype, or what you look like on the outside. Some other things that can cause genetic changes in a population would be reproductive isolation. And so that's when populations can't breed or reproduce because of geographic separation. So that means that they might be separated by a canyon. Gradualism is the gradual change over a long period of time that eventually leads to a new species. And things like mutations and environmental changes can all contribute to gradualism. So we're going to talk a little bit about adaptations and how adaptations might help an organism be fit for their environment. So this is a little bit going back to ecology. So an adaptation is a trait that you inherit, and it increases the organism's chance for survival. So anything that's an adaptation is going to increase that organism's chance for survival. So an adaptation can be a behavior, a sound an animal or organism makes, your appearance, okay? And adaptations tend to become common in a species, and the more common it is, the more adapted the species is. So adaptations can be physical, okay? So something you can see in the organism. Okay, we think of phenotype. Speed, camouflage, claws, quills, etc. Coloration, remember. Adaptation can also be in plants. Plants can be adapted for an environment. Adaptations can also be behavioral. So how does an organism respond? They can be solitary, meaning they like to be alone. They can like to be in herds, packs. It might be their activity, such as a mating ritual. So you have to remember that the individuals don't get to pick and choose their adaptations. Remember, the environment sort of selects what's beneficial. So adaptations are already present among some individuals, and as adaptations become more common, the species adapts. So mimicry might be one adaptation that is advantageous for an animal. So when one species is able to resemble another, the species is harmless, resembling something that is harmful. So for example, this butterfly, it looks like an owl, okay? and the butterfly itself is harmless, but it resembles something harmful, which will make the owl less available to predators. Additionally, also with this fish, it may resemble some kind of predator that a predator itself would not want to attack. Camouflage is another type of adaptation. It resembles, the organism will resemble its surroundings. Defense mechanisms are also used by many animals, although defense is not technically camouflage. Fish, crabs, bugs, snakes, frogs. If you can think of any others, most commonly I think of skunks. Okay, skunks spraying would be an adaptation that would give defense to that animal. So if you can find the two animals in these pictures, they've already kind of circled them. But if they weren't circled, would you be able to tell that this was not a leaf? And would you be able to see this very, very well? And you have to remember that the potential predators may not even have eyes as well adapted, so it might not even see this border right here. And so this animal is very, very well adapted to its surroundings, which makes it well adapted and more likely to survive. So we have to remember that natural selection is we see variations in the population. They survive, they reproduce, and they pass their variations or traits to the next generation. And it takes many generations to develop. Okay, so if we think about a variation in the peppered moth lab, the peppered moth had two variations. So we had the white moth that had speckles on it, and then another variation of that moth was a dark variation of the moth that was more suited for the trees that were covered in soot. So this would be the dark moth. Okay, so there's two variations right there. So variation 1 and variation 2. Remember, this one is white. It has a white phenotype. And remember, our white phenotype is because of its genes. Okay, and then this one has a black or dark phenotype. And that's because of its genes that make it look black. Okay, so when certain variations survive, okay, a bird trying to attack, and then this one dies over time, the dark one is able to reproduce, and then eventually this white moth, it will be extinguished within that population. So a couple of important notes about natural selection. If a species does not adapt, it's not going to survive, okay? Really, really, really important is that an individual cannot change in its lifetime. It can pass on changes though, like so if there's a mutation within the sex cells, it can pass those mutations off to its offspring, okay? Natural selection doesn't necessarily give organisms what they need. It's a process that favors certain variations. So if you think about the peppered moth, okay, the peppered moth, it's not like the white did not turn into the dark moth, okay? That didn't happen. What happened was that the white moths were all eaten. And if the white moths were eaten, then they could no longer reproduce to make more white moths. And the moths that did not get eaten were the dark moths, and they were allowed to reproduce. So the majority of what was in the population were the dark moths. The driving force or mechanism behind the process of natural selection is genetic variation. Okay, so genetic variation is variety or choices. So again, in the peppered moth, there were two choices, the white and the dark. Now, if you think about it, if the only choice was the white moth, then they would have all been killed out and you would have never seen the black evolve in the population. But because there were two choices, over time, what could happen is that the white were not selected to go on, or they were selected to be eaten by the bird. And by the fact that the black wasn't selected by the bird, their whole species or population were selected to go on. Natural selection favors upon phenotypes, okay? And when this happens, it causes a change in the gene pool, okay? So remember, all the individuals in a population make up all the genes that are sort of like in this great big pool. So natural variation and artificial selection. So remember, natural variation is differences among individuals of a species. Okay, so again, the peppered moth would be a great one to look at. Okay, or different beaks in the finches. Okay, in Darwin's birds. Okay. Artificial selection is when we do selective breeding to enhance desired traits among stocks or crops, or the one you guys are most familiar with is dogs. So that's when man chooses the traits, is artificial selection. So again, an example of selective breeding would be, choosing dog breeds. Right here, so dogs, okay. Breeding cattle, okay, for high fat and high meat, okay. Horse breeders, okay, for strength and speed. And exotic animals, such as this cat right here. All right, or hairless, because if you have allergies, you can't tolerate hair in your house. So in Darwin's book, The Origin of Species, you are responsible for remembering that, and take a look at the time. This is also about the time Gregor Mendel came about, okay? Darwin didn't share his research outwardly. He only shared it with a select few, some of his colleagues. He actually really decided to go ahead and publish his works after Alfred Russel Wallace published an article with ideas similar to Darwin's. So I think his buddy there gave him some encouragement to publish. Because remember, at the time, the Bible was saying that the world was 6,000 years old, and Darwin, this was going against popular thinking. And we all know what happens when you go against popular thinking. You run the risk of being laughed at or put aside or told that you're crazy. So Gregor Mendel's studies are sort of the missing link of what Darwin was trying to describe as evolution. He didn't have a way to explain how natural selection was happening. He didn't have a mechanism or a way to say, hey, this is the way this is happening. I have proof that it's happening, but I don't know how it's happening. And so he was saying, how could variable variations be transmitted to later generations? Mendel knew this because he knew that these variations, Mendel knew that the variations were actually called traits. So it was Mendel's rediscovery of his work in the 20th century in which evolutionary theory kind of became found. So a lot of people, I like this picture. It's commonly used to describe evolution, and it's a false picture. Scientists do not believe that we came from some kind of monkey, okay, that this is not true, okay. We do share a common ancestor, but we didn't go suddenly turn from a monkey to this individual to this individual to, okay, this is not what we believe in, okay? That's not evolution. That's not how that happens, okay? But we all do share some kind of common ancestor. So the best way to think about evolution is sort of like a tree or a family tree, rather than some kind of lineage. It's a branching of a tree. And this is actually a picture from one of Darwin's, one of his observations, which is his family tree that he was spreading out. So Charles Darwin came up with this very famous phrase, common descent with modification. If we look at that word descent, we know that it means to descend. And if you are a descendant, you are sort of a child of somebody. And modification means to change, okay? So you're descending from something with change over time. So he said that organisms descended from a common ancestor. And what you're seeing right here is every single time there is a branching point right here, that is some kind of ancestor that goes this way and this way. So this would be organism A, organism B, organism C, organism D, organism E, and organism F. And if you go back this way between A and B, and if you keep going right here, you notice that there is another organism that would be right here, which would be organism G, and that organism A and organism B share a similar branch with organism G, and there's also a similar organism here, which would be organism H, and there's some kind of event that makes A and B split off from organism H, and that event could be a natural selection event, okay? And the idea is that as individuals of a species reproduce, they change over time. And these changes could lead to a divergence from a common form, okay? So the divergence would be at this point here, where die means to split into two, right? Die means two, and there's a splitting into two different branches, and the common form would be right here with H. And at this point where they split, you have two new species that are formed. So there's some kind of something going on in the environment that causes that split, and we call that common descent with modification, that both A and B descended from that organism right there, and they descended with some changes which makes them unique from one another there. So to be clear, descent with modification takes place over long periods of time. It's not like it happens overnight. And what we'll see is natural selection can be absorbed. You'll see natural selection observed as changes in body structures, ecological niches, habitats, and behaviors. And remember your niche all the way back from ecology. Your niche equals a job. So your job that you have to do within the environment. Okay, so your job might change, and if your job changes, that means you have evolved. Okay, you have evolved. Okay, I like this little diagram here. It's important to pay attention here to this diagram. We're going to come back to it when we talk about homologous structures. But one way that you can evolve is that you can evolve with your body structures. So this shows basically what is called a pentadactyl limb. Okay, so pentadactyl, penti meaning penta meaning 5. Okay, so penta equals 5. And dactyl is what I think of when I think of these fingers here. So what you're seeing here is the upper arm, sorry, your upper arm, let me just fix this right here. Your upper arm would be here, the humerus, okay? So if you see, a lot of animals have this same kind of structure up here in the upper arm, okay? So we all have this humerus, okay? And then we also have the radius and ulna, which would be this structure right here, okay? So the idea here is that we're showing that these vertebrate animals all descended from something similar because we have some similar structures. The wrist, which would be your carpals, so even the dolphin has what would be kind of considered carpals. The bat has kind of these carpal-looking structures. There's a carpal right there, carpal right in here, okay? So there's the carpals, and then finally we have what are the phalanges, which are basically your fingers, okay? And even in the dolphin, we have these structures, okay? Now, these limbs don't do the same thing, okay? So a bat, it flies. The fin is used for swimming. This leg is used for walking as well as that leg, okay? This arm is used for grasping. But even though they have different functions, they all have a similar pattern of structure where they have the humerus, the radius and the ulna, the carpals, and the metacarpals and phalanges. And so that shows that we have sort of evolved from a similar ancestor. So descent with modification, species today, it says also that species today look different from their ancestors. And you have to remember that before Darwin's time, the Bible said that all the animals that are here today have been here since the beginning of time. And Darwin said, no, that is not true, that the animals that were here long ago in the past look very, very different than today. And many of those animals from the past have died, and any animal that's here today has descended from those from those extinct animals with changes. So it's not like the animals that have been placed here have been the same since the beginning of time. And Darwin had fossil evidence to prove this. Now, you can't fault the people at the time for thinking what they did, because they didn't have the same world experiences as Darwin. They didn't have cameras back then, so Darwin couldn't come back and take pictures of what he was trying to prove to people. They had to take his word for it. Okay, so an example is this Megatherium is an extinct ground sloth. So if you think about a sloth, this thing was huge because it was the size of an elephant, and a current day sloth is probably about the size of a small dog. So there's been change over time. Things haven't been here the same way since the beginning of time. Descent with modification also shows that there in the fossil record, you have what are called transitional fossils, okay? So this organism called Pachycetus, is a relative of these organisms right here, which are now the relatives of modern day whales and dolphins, which are not pictured here. And so these organisms in between are called transition fossils. And they show the gradual change in the body over time to the modern day organism. And that's what these transition fossils do. So there is descent. So this organism and this organism is descended from Pachycetus, with modification change over time. So we're going to speak very, very briefly on the concept of divergence. Remember, di means two. Okay, so it means to go into two separate ways. And it's the accumulation or collecting of differences among two groups of the same species, but then become so different that they can no longer interbreed, and that develops a new species. Yet the common ancestor kind of remains. So what they're trying to show here is that this particular finch basically turned into this organism here, but then it diverged into these organisms, which are different species. So they're all finches, but they're all different species of this organism right here. So you can see as it diverges or splits off into two or more different groups. So the concept of speciation means that you form a new species, and that's called speciation. To go back a little bit, and please add this to your notes. When we talk about species, all organisms on the planet have what is given a scientific name. So please add this to your notes. We all have a scientific name, okay? So for humans, our scientific name is actually Homo sapien. And the first word in that name is what's called the genus. And the second word in that name is called the species. Okay. And so the wolf, for example, its scientific name is called Canis lupus. Okay. So remember, if we kind of go back here, the genus is given in blue here, okay, and the species is given in green. And so if I look at the genus for wolf, it would be Canis, and if I looked at the species in the wolf, it would be lupus. So the coyote, which is a relative of the wolf, it has a genus, a scientific name, and its scientific name is Canis latrans. So they both belong to the same genus, but they are two different species. And you should probably be able to very obviously tell that, okay? So dogs are kind of also in this category. Okay, they resemble a wolf, they resemble a coyote, so dogs are Canis familiaris. Okay, they share the same species, the same genus with the wolf and the coyote. But again, dogs are their own species, and you can tell that by the way they look and also their behavior, okay? So, but somewhere way back in time, the wolf, the coyote, and the dog all shared a common ancestor, and then, so whatever organism that was, and then they split into three species. So divergence is that force behind making new species. Remember, speciation is the making of new species. So remember, all dogs are the same species, okay? But due to different selection, they are very different. So Great Dane versus a Chihuahua, that makes even a subspecies. So subspecies is members of the same species that differ genetically because of different living conditions. So the two models of evolution are, and we won't go over this too much, but it's just good for you to know them. Gradualism, which is a model of hypothesis in evolution in which gradual change appears over a long period of time, which is what they're trying to show here. Okay, so they're showing time going this way, and then the changes that you see are displayed as we go up this way. Okay, punctuated equilibrium is shown here, and that's a model of evolution in which periods of rapid change in species are separated by periods with little or no change. So there's like a rapid change here, and then long period, and then a very fast change, and then long period of time, okay? So this one you see, in gradualism, you see a bunch of intermediate species in gradualism, whereas in punctuated equilibrium, you don't see as many intermediate species. In terms of time, there's time scales for evolutionary time scale. Macroevolution means long time scale events that can create and destroy entire species. This is kind of mostly related to like the 5 maybe mass extinctions on our planet, which killed like over 95% of life, okay? Typically, though, when we're dealing with evolution, we really deal with it on a microevolution scale, which is still a really long time for humans, but it's relatively shorter compared to macroevolution. So short time scale events from generation to generation that change the genotypes and phenotypes of populations. And again, the famous peppered moth, whereas you can see there's like a mutation in one gene of this moth that will make it so that that moth is black, and this one's really well camouflaged. That's one of the white peppered moths right there. So it's just one change, one little base pair in the DNA that is able to make this moth look different than this moth. And then you can see that nature is actually going to favor this moth's survival, and this one's likely to get eaten up because you can see it pretty well. And if it dies, remember, it's not going to be able to pass its genes on to its offspring. So make sure that you're all caught up with your notes. Please come to class with any questions that you have tomorrow, and we will go over this and then move on to our next lesson. Thank you.